Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to the session. I wanted to talk today about people analytics and the changing role of HR. And I thought it was really interesting that this morning's session, opened by Julie, talked about how HR professionals are the architects of change and transformation, and how you are an integral part, if not, leaders in terms of design, develop and delivery of the future workforce. And I wanted to talk about really how that impacts in terms of people analytics and consider, what the future of HR is going to be. My name is David Jones-Stanley. I'm part of the Liaison workforce team, and I've been working in the space of data and HR for the past 20 years. And it's really interesting times that we're living through when we consider that 82% of HR professionals believe that the role of HR will change beyond recognition over the next 10 years. So today I wanted to share some of my thoughts with you, and some interesting information, I hope, to hopefully provoke and start a debate around what that might look like. So I'm sharing my screen with you at the moment, so hopefully you will be able to see all of that. If you've got any questions, by the way, then feel free to type them into the chat, but there will be time at the end for open up the discussion and talk about those. So when we think about HR and the changing role of HR and how that links into people analytics, I think there are two questions that we need to consider first of all. And the first one is thinking about what will HR look like in the future. And I guess this is a quite a difficult question to answer. And we've heard from some of the speakers today that, there isn't a playbook that we can go to that will say this is what HR is going to look like in the future. And this is what, it's going to look like within the NHS. And the second thing we also need to consider is what might we expect to see. And without having sort of a crystal ball in front of us to think about that, that can be quite an ask to see into the future and to think about what are we going to expect. I think if we'd have had a crystal ball maybe 12 months ago, none of us would have expected to see the year 2020 pan out quite like it did. But what we can do, and what we've got the ability to do, and often we have the ability to do this through the use of data and through analytics, is to see what's happened in the past, to look at the trends, to see behaviors, to see how things have happened before, and to estimate, and to predict what that might look like in the future. We can also see, using data and technology, what's happening now. How are our employees behaving? How are we as a function in terms of HR performing? And we can also, as mentioned by Tom earlier, we can think about what's happening in other industries to see how they're progressing, to see what their futures are looking like. So we can say actually what went well there, can we use that within our own functions and within our own industry itself. So whilst we don't have a crystal ball to see exactly what's happening in the future, we can start to think about and consider some of these megatrends, as we've heard about this morning. So when we look at sort of the HR as a function, and we consider what that's going to look like, there are probably three distinct megatrends that we need to consider and we need to think about. And the first one, and this isn't to say that these are the only trends, and obviously we have, HR trends that are more longer term in terms of how we're looking at, diversity, and how we're looking at inclusion and so on. And we're not talking about megatrends in terms of, multi-generational workforce, because that's all things that are happening, now. That's the today, that's the moment that we're living in. But when we think about megatrends, we do have to acknowledge that the employee themselves are changing. we need to consider this because this, directly impacts on how we provide, HR services to our employees, how we interact with the workforce, how we design the workforce going forward, how we deliver what that future workforce is going to look like. So when we consider things around the employee, as I say, it's not necessarily just the changing workforce in terms of diversity and multi-generational workforce, but it's thinking about increased mobility. It's thinking about how our employees are going to come into the organization and what their expectations are. It's thinking about how are we going to service those employees who are going to want multiple roles, who are going to have multiple careers, who are going to move within the organization, and also how they're going to move within the region or within the system as a whole. So it places a lot of focus on how we're going to benchmark those, how we're going to monitor those, how we're going to measure that mobility, and as people move from one organization to another, how people collaborate, how people move throughout the system. We also need to consider the identity of the employee and the sort of both the physical and the digital identity. And Helen mentioned this in her session earlier on this morning, where we talked about influencers and social influencing, and it really does sort of link into the values and the employee expectations when we're considering actually people's identity and how they influence the work and therefore influence the HR function itself. One of the things that really interests me is the idea of how or what sort of presence do you have when it comes to social media? How are you pushing forward your values as an organization? When people are considering joining you as an employer, they start very early on before the recruitment. The days of being able to post a vacancy and have people sort of apply and go through that process, that traditional way of recruitment, that's changing. We need to consider how the employee interacts with us at a very sort of early stage. We also need to think about, the employee in terms of, their flexibility, whether it's looking at the gig economy and whether we're considering how we interact with people on a very short-term basis to do a specific role or a specific task within the organization, or whether it's a broader conversation around how we engage with the flexible workers, whether they're working part-time or 0 hours, or whether they're flexible in terms of where they work in the organization or indeed multiple organizations. And whilst flexible working, I think, has been on the agenda for some time, certainly in terms of HR, we're not seeing, we're not seeing that being delivered, I guess, in the operational setting. We're only seeing, limited numbers of people taking up flexible working, and there's a huge drive. So that, I think, is definitely going to be something we need to consider when we think about the changing way in terms of the employee is changing, but also how we start to measure and how we start to look at the data surrounding, flexible working. The other area that we see in terms of the mega trends and things that are changing that will certainly influence the HR function is the environment. Where people are working, how the jobs are being completed, how the work is being completed, is going to change and has been changing. And I think from a 2020 point of view, we can't escape the fact that we've had COVID, and it was mentioned earlier on that whilst it's been, nobody would wish COVID or the year that we've had, there are some things that it has helped with in terms of accelerating that change, in terms of allowing us to break down some of those barriers, allowing us to be open to the possibilities of flexible working and different ways of working and thinking about the environment that we're working in. And in terms of, just thinking about those environments, everything is changing. The way in which the clinical environment is changing, whether it's in operating theatres with surgeons, 30 miles away, using networks to complete operations through robotics, whether it's the clinical settings in terms of consultations with patients via Zoom and Teams and online sessions rather than face-to-face interactions. All of those things are changing, as well as the traditional office environments and areas that HR professionals work in. That's changing as well. So we're no longer thinking about we have to go into a physical location in order to complete the task. We don't have to be in the physical location in order to have those conversations, and it changes the way we consider remote working. And I don't know about you, but this wouldn't be a bad place to be doing work. But the idea that we can be more mobile and we can be more remote, and I'm thinking particularly around yourselves. How can we include some of these different locations into our way of working? Do we have to rely on the traditional way of working where we're going into the office and that's where we need to be seen to be visible? Actually, we can interact with people in many different ways, and that includes home working, and I think we've probably all experienced that over the last several months, and for some we're probably getting a bit tired of it as well. We're itching to get back out and to see people, but we need to consider how does that impact on us as HR professionals and how we interact with people. It also throws up a lot of new ways of thinking about data, and Helen mentioned in her conversation earlier around this ability to trust people to do their job when they're not physically in the same space. And I think that's really interesting because we need to think about the culture of how we're working. We need to think about how we're operating and in terms of how we're managing that from a workforce point of view. So there's lots of questions around how the environment is changing. And I guess a lot of this is going to be supported by the way in which we use technology. And I think the way in which we use technology has been changing for some time. Technology is enabling us to collaborate more. It's enabling us to see the world very differently in terms of how we're performing, what our measurements are, but it's also enabling us to think about how we access information. And I'm not just thinking about the HR teams here, I'm thinking about our employees. How do they access learning? How do they access information every day, 24 hours a day? Access to technology is enabling us to do that. But it's also helping us to network more, not in terms of physical networks, but in terms of, how do we reach out to our colleagues? How do we reach out to our peers? We were talking earlier about the use of looking at the crystal ball and how we look at what's happening in other industries. We have access now, and we will continue to have access, and this is going into the future, to those networks. How do we reach out to those people and say, actually, Google, what are you doing in terms of your people analytics? What are you doing in terms of your HR strategy? We have the ability now to reach around the globe, to talk to HR professionals within healthcare in multiple geographies to find out what's happening and to exchange ideas and to share thoughts and to really sort of embrace that information and that new way of working. The other thing that technology brings to bear is the use of automation, the use of taking those repetitive tasks and those repetitive processes, and that sort of move away from being process-driven HR, taking away those tasks and automating them. And that's really going to help free up time for the HR teams and to be able to look at those tasks and say, actually, if it's repetitive, we can get a robot to do that and we can push that to one side and we can actually focus and concentrate on what's most important to us. The other use around technology is the explosion around analytics to really provide deeper insights and understanding. And this really is a key element to how HR within the NHS are going to deliver on things like the people plan, how you're going to design, develop and deliver the workforce of the future, a key part of that will be, of course, analytics. The other area that we're going to see in terms of megatrends for technology is the integration of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and augmented intelligence. You know, as I said before, that we're never going to lose the H in HR. You know, you're always going to need that human intervention. So that's where we're seeing the augmented intelligence. How can we use data? How can we use the machine learning to support our efforts in order to make those changes and to deliver, I should say, that transformation that we need to. But of course, some of those tasks can be delivered via, you know, bots, and we need to consider, you know, how are we going to integrate those? So these trends, you know, do mean that we are sort of working towards, you know, a change in HR. It's not quite going to quite be your sort of, you know, robots taking over the human tasks. You know, we're still very much going to be needing, you know, people to drive this. So there's no danger that, you know, robots are coming in to take over. But when we do think about HR and we do think about the changing role of HR, we need to think about, okay, you know, all of those things in terms of megatrends, all of those things in terms of, you know, how the employee is changing, how we're going to use technology, how we're going to use data, and consider sort of this. How are we making the move and that separation from traditional HR operational roles to people transformation roles? Now, that's something that has started in many organizations, and you may be one of those organizations where you're thinking about this, but it's still something, you know, when we look at the profession as a whole, it's still something that hasn't quite sort of taken hold. And around about, there's some recent research that was released that suggested 94% of HR professionals believe that this transition from HR operational roles to a more people transformation will take about 3 to 5 years. So we need to consider, what does that journey look like? How are we going to move away from that more traditional way of working to a more sort of HR transformation way of working? And how do we include, you know, elements of collaboration? How do we think about how we're going to instigate that change and that transformation, not from, as Helen was talking about earlier, from a top-down approach, but from that sort of collaborative approach, you know, making sure that we have all of our stakeholders in the room. How are we going to make sure that as HR professionals, we are key to the redesigning of the workforce and to consider all of those changes in terms of the employee, the environment, the technology? How are we going to change the way we work as HR professionals in order to redesign the work itself? You know, the inclusion of data, the inclusion of robotics in how we diagnose, how we treat, how we work, you know, genomics. How do we include that? How do we need to, or what do we need to consider when it comes to ethics and how we implement those and how we measure those from a HR point of view? We also need to think about how we rescale the people function. I don't think it's fair to say that as a HR function we need to change, and we need to, you know, we need to acknowledge that, of course, but we need to think about what new skills are we going to need in the future. What are the new roles that you are going to see? They may be emerging roles that are coming through now. They may be roles and skills you think, you know, we need to improve our analytical capability. We need to think about how we communicate with our employees. We need to think about those new roles in terms of, you know, digital leadership. We need to think about roles in terms of data analysis and how we're going to use the number of different data sources that we have available to us. How are we going to use that as a HR function, but how are we going to lead in terms of that conversation itself? And also, how are we going to use analytics to tell our story? You know, how are we going to, you know, really make sure that we take advantage of having that seat at the table, how we use data to influence the workforce of the future? So this is really, you know, key to how HR is going to change. And one of the fundamental part of how we're going to do this is through the use of people analytics. Now, people analytics is something that's very close to my heart. It was using data, from when I started my HR career back in the mid-90s, which will also give you an idea as to how young I am. But we use people analytics then, so this isn't new, but how we're using it, I think, is new. How we're thinking about people analytics to deliver different services, whether it's through workforce planning, whether it's through looking at diversity and inclusion. All of the areas that we're focused on as HR professionals are supported by people analytics. And whether that's looking at some of the more traditional areas around costs, compliance, productivity, recruitment, or whether it's thinking about actually how do we change the way we look at things like turnover. If we're thinking about the employee being increasingly mobile, whether it's internal or external, or how they're moving around, does that change how we measure turnover? Does that change how we perceive turnover? Does it change how we record and how we measure recruitment activities? How do we start to use data analytics to question the behaviors and to understand some of those influences that are happening within the organization? Now, if any of these items that we've got listed here are part of your agenda, and I'm sure they all are, you must have people analytics in order to understand them, in order to measure them, in order to deliver those going forward. But when we think about how we're using people analytics, we often sort of come up against challenges around adoption of new technologies. There's only around about 26 to 30% of organizations that are actually using people analytics strategically within their organization. So one of the questions that we need to think about, and one of the questions that we'll pose today is, what's your organization's HR strategy regarding people data? How are we viewing people data within the organization? How are we using that in terms of how we're connecting the data, how we're triangulating the data, how we're using that data to really provide the evidence for change and the discussions. One of the sort of I guess the mistakes that we make when we think about people analytics and we think about the data that we have is by trying to sort of boil the ocean, as it were. We generate, terabytes and terabytes of information every second. We generate more information today and more data today than we ever have done in the entire history of the human species. So what do? We tend to go in and we say, we've got all of this data, we need to do something fantastic with it. It needs to tell us everything we need to know. And we end up with far too much information that we can't digest, too much information that we can't understand. And we need to think about actually, when we're considering our people analytics strategy, we need to be able to answer those three questions fundamentally beyond anything else, which is, will the content, will the information, will the data that I have assist in specific workforce decisions? If not, then we really should be, reconsidering why we're using that data, why we're collecting that data. Is that data of value? We also need to think about and answer, does the content track important workforce KPIs? And I sort of stress the word important because we seem to be overrun with KPIs. We have KPIs for almost everything at the moment. So are they important? Are they adding value? Are they helping us make decisions? And the final one really is, can the content measure progress in specific workforce strategies and objectives? Because one of the things we need to do is not just measure what's happening now, but also measure over time, measure the impact of the change, measure the impact of the changing behaviors or the transformation that we're putting through. So when we're considering, what our link is from our strategy to our people data, we need to consider the content, whether it's important enough, and whether we can measure progress over time. We also need to think about and answer the question, you know, do we understand the value of people analytics? You know, how can we take something, how can we grow that, how can we invest in people analytics to deliver something in terms of for the organization? And again, you know, when we're working with organizations, and we see this time and time again, you know, we have, and it's not just large organizations, but we have, you know, NHS organizations with reporting teams that are churning out data, they're accessing multiple systems. You know, we're combining everything manually, usually through the use of Excel, you know, and I've said this many times before, I think sometimes the world would end if we didn't have Excel, but we're pulling all of this together in not a very sort of sophisticated or sustainable way. And what that leads to is, again, you know, too much information that isn't adding enough value, but actually it's taking us away from the important part of our job, which is about actually how do we use the information, not how do we sort of manipulate the information. So again, we need to think about, you know, the data that we have and what it will provide, but we need to think about, you know, can we use this data more efficiently and more effectively? We need to think about, you know, the benefits of using this data in terms of, is it supporting, you know, organizational agility? Am I able to use this again to make decisions? And, you know, how will this help you become a stronger, you know, business partner in your organization? How can you use data in order to strengthen that relationship with your colleagues, in order to drive the organization forward? And the sort of the third sort of question that we get asked a lot and we need to consider is around understanding analytics in terms of the data quality challenges. And this can often be a significant barrier in using data and using analytics within the organization. And it's really important because, you know, as soon as somebody logs in, and we've probably all done it ourselves, you know, hands up, we've all looked at information and thought, that doesn't look right, therefore I don't trust the data, and therefore I disengage. So when we're thinking about using people analytics within our own organizations, and some of you may have already done this before, we need to think about, okay, how do we make sure that the data is good enough for us to present to the organization? How do we get them to sort of own the data themselves? And we need to consider, you know, is the data correct? And not just in terms of, you know, the accuracy of the data, but also thinking about, you know, is the data timely enough? Are we getting it at the right time in the cycle? Are the right people, or do the right people have access to the information when they need? And have we got the information at a granular enough level in order to provide the insights that we need from our information and from our data? And I think even if you've sort of done that, you know, in terms of answered all of those questions, and, you know, you understand the quality of the data. So even if you have the right strategy, even if you have the, you know, understand the value, and even once you've gone through the quality, we still see many barriers to using people analytics in organizations. And I wanted to share with you some of the things that we hear, and you may have heard this yourself. You may have said this yourself. I know there's certainly one or two that I may have used in the past. When we think about, you know, barriers to using analytics and using data. And I think if we, as a function, as a profession, are going to sort of push forward with, you know, workforce transformation and workforce redesign, we really need to sort of call out these behaviours as part of, you know, what we think about to be our culture within the organisation, and we need to sort of tackle them head on. So, you know, when our people say, you know, oh, you know, when we hear in terms of data, you know, or systems or technology, our people won't use them, I think what we're often hearing here is that our people don't understand the value. And I think we need to be able to question and call out these things. And these are all things that, as I say, we've heard, and many, you know, we may have said. We also see our people can't use it. so whether it's new technology. And we have this conversation repeatedly around the use of tech and the use of data. People can't use that, they're not tech savvy. So we need to think about, well, actually, how can we support as a HR function? How can we support as OD professionals? How can we support our employees in order to use technology better than they may be today? We also hear this, we've tried it before, we didn't work. So what lessons did we learn? For every failure, there's a lesson in there. And we may try things time and time again, but it's okay. It's okay to try things and not for it to work. And it's okay to learn from that and to try again and to continue to try until we get it right. I think we also hear this quite a lot as well. We've always done it this way. And I think out of them all, this is the one that is probably the most painful, especially when we're talking about transformation and we're talking about change, because it really does stop us from moving forward, and we need to consider how we do things differently. And the final one that I wanted to share is this one: we don't trust the numbers. We see this and we hear this, and I hear this time and time again, and it links back to what we were talking about in terms of data quality and how we break down some of those barriers around understanding: is it accurate, is it timely, do the right people have the right information at the right time, and is it granular enough? And once we understand those, then the numbers will start to be trusted and we can start to push that out there. But I think in order to sort of move on and to sort of get past that, we need to think about, three things. We need to think about, and I guess a question, we need to have an open door policy when it comes to data. We need to be transparent. One of the things that will prevent us from moving forward with any sort of data analytics, people analytics, whether it's people data, whether it's finance data, whether it's operational data, is not allowing people to see the data, not putting it out there to say, this is what we have, being very transparent about the information that you've got available. The other thing we need to consider is who owns the data. And I have this conversation with HR professionals often. I think there's a misconception out there that, people and HR data is owned by the HR function. I would argue that the HR function or the people function consume the data. And actually the HR data itself is owned by the employee and the manager. So how do we hand those keys over? How do we say to them, it's your data, you're responsible for it, therefore you need to make sure it's right? And I think sometimes as HR professionals, you take that burden on, and actually, you're not in control of how that data shapes itself or how that data is updated and so on. And the third and sort of final thing is really making sure that we understand the direction that you're going in. We have a plan. We understand what we want to achieve in terms of our strategy and how data fits into it. We understand how we're going to use and adopt different technologies in order to support that. And we understand what benefit and value it's going to give to both ourselves as a function, to the organization as a whole, but also to the individual employee, and how do we share that value with them so that they can see that actually this is going to give them benefits in terms of their experience, in terms of their own well-being, in terms of how they're going to perform their job and their tasks. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. So I'm going to sort of open it up and ask, does anybody have any questions, any comments, any insights that they'd like to share with the people on the session? So I'll open that up. Okay, so if there's no questions, I think we'll call time on this session, so you've got a little bit of time back before the next main stage session, I believe. So thank you very much.